Tombstone, 1881, $10,000 bounty on Liana Redhawk and the bounty hunter who couldn't walk away. The sun beat down on the small town of Tombstone, Arizona, turning the dusty streets into waves of shimmering heat. The wooden buildings, worn and weathered, seemed to lean into each other as if seeking comfort from the relentless sun. Tombstone was no ordinary town. It was a place where fortunes could be made or lost in the blink of an eye, and where law and chaos lived side by side. Outlaws walked openly, and the clinking of coins mingled with the distant sounds of gunfire. Everyone in town seemed to have a story, a secret, or a reason to fear the wrong person. Among the many whispers in the town, one name traveled faster than any other: Liana Redhawk. People spoke of her in hushed tones, some with fear, others with admiration. She was known to be clever, quick, and unpredictable. Some said she could vanish into the desert as easily as a shadow at sunset. Others claimed that no lock or trap could hold her, and that she had a way of leaving a mark without anyone knowing she had been there. Her reputation was so strong that the local newspapers had put a $10,000 bounty on her head, a sum unimaginable at the time. That amount of money attracted all kinds of people to Tombstone: the greedy, the desperate, and the reckless. But it also attracted the experienced, the patient, and the careful. Among those drawn by the bounty was a man named Silas Kane, a bounty hunter whose reputation preceded him, though he preferred to keep it quiet. Silas was not like other men who chased bounties simply for money. His motivations were different, shaped by a life filled with difficult choices and hard lessons. He had learned that, in a land without strict law, survival and justice often meant bending the rules, but never breaking his own code. Silas had faced outlaws before, and he knew the danger of underestimating someone clever. That knowledge, combined with a certain curiosity about Liana Redhawk, made him come to Tombstone despite the risks. Silas arrived at the town as the sun began to dip behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows over the streets. The air was dry, carrying the scent of dust, leather, and smoke from the saloons. Children ran through the streets, their laughter mixing with the sound of wagons and the occasional shout from a distant brawl. Tombstone seemed alive, chaotic, and dangerous all at once. A perfect stage for the drama that was about to unfold. Silas's first steps were cautious. He observed everything: the people, the buildings, the small details that often revealed more than words. He knew that to find Liana he would need more than just luck. He would need patience, strategy, and an understanding of human nature. Silas had spent years learning how to read people, how to notice patterns, and how to predict actions before they happened. In Tombstone, such skills were not just useful, they were essential for survival. As he walked past the saloons and general stores, he overheard snippets of conversation. Some talked about the latest heist, others about the bounty hunters who had already arrived. One man mentioned seeing a woman with striking features and a sharp look, someone who seemed untouchable even in the crowded streets. Silas filed this information away. Tombstone, despite its rough exterior, had a rhythm of life that only those who spent time observing could understand. The townspeople had adapted to the constant presence of danger. Shopkeepers learned when to lock their doors, saloon owners learned which patrons were trouble, and local lawmen balanced enforcing the law with protecting their own. In this environment, Liana Redhawk thrived. She moved carefully, always aware of her surroundings, and always staying one step ahead of anyone who might try to catch her. Silas spent the next few days quietly gathering information. He visited the saloons not to drink or gamble, but to watch and listen. He talked to the people who knew more than they should, men and women who had seen Liana in action or had heard rumors of her plans. With each conversation, Silas pieced together a picture of her life, her methods, and her possible next move. He learned that Liana was not just a criminal seeking wealth. She had her own reasons, motivations shaped by a life of hardship and survival. Some believed she was fighting for justice in her own way. Others thought she simply enjoyed the thrill of outsmarting the law. The more Silas learned, the more complicated the pursuit became. Liana was clever, yes, but she was also cautious and aware of the consequences of her actions. She didn't act recklessly, and she avoided unnecessary risks. Silas realized that catching her would not be a simple matter of luck or brute force. It would require understanding her thinking, predicting her next move, and waiting for the perfect moment. And that was a challenge he was willing to take. One evening, Silas noticed something unusual. A group of people gathered near one of the town's smaller saloons, speaking in low tones, their eyes darting around nervously. Silas approached quietly, making no effort to hide his presence but giving the impression of being uninterested. Through careful observation, he realized that Liana might be among them, negotiating something important. Her reputation for boldness fit the scene perfectly. She could walk into a room full of strangers and command attention without speaking loudly. The aura of confidence and danger that surrounded her made it clear why she was so feared and admired. As Silas watched, he noticed the reactions of the townspeople around her. Some were wary, keeping their distance. Others were intrigued, drawn by the energy she carried. Silas understood that this woman had a unique ability to influence people without appearing to try. She moved with a purpose, her eyes scanning the room, always aware of her surroundings. For Silas was both a challenge and a source of respect. He knew that capturing her would require not only skill, but also a deep understanding of who she was. Silas decided to take a patient approach. He would not rush in or reveal his intentions. Instead, he would observe, gather information, and wait for the right moment to act. In Tombstone, patience was a valuable weapon, sometimes more effective than a gun. Silas had learned that lessons from past pursuits. He had seen bounty hunters make mistakes because of impatience or arrogance, and he intended not to repeat those errors. As night fell, Tombstone transformed. The streets grew quieter, lit by the warm glow of lanterns. Shadows danced across the walls of the buildings, and the sounds of the day gave way to the murmurs of evening conversations and the occasional burst of laughter from a nearby saloon. Silas walked alone, thinking about the days ahead. He knew that the pursuit of Liana Redhawk would test him in ways he had never imagined. It would challenge his skills, his patience, and his understanding of justice. But deep down, he welcomed the challenge. The thrill of the hunt, combined with the mystery of the woman he pursued, gave him a sense of purpose he had not felt in years. By the first week of his stay in Tombstone, Silas had begun to form a tentative strategy. He would continue to observe, wait for opportunities, and learn as much as possible about Liana's movements. Each piece of information he gathered brought him closer to understanding her, and perhaps one day, capturing her. But even as he planned, he could not shake the feeling that this pursuit would be unlike any other he had experienced. Liana Redhawk was not just another outlaw. She was clever, resourceful, and unpredictable, and Silas knew that he would need every ounce of skill and intelligence he possessed to match her. The sun rose and set over Tombstone, marking the passage of days. Each morning, Silas continued his quiet investigations, blending into the town's rhythms while keeping his eyes on the woman who had captured the attention of the entire territory. And each evening he reflected on what he had learned, refining his plans and preparing for the inevitable moment when he would finally come face to face with Liana Redhawk. That moment, he knew, would test both of them in ways neither could fully anticipate. In the midst of the desert and the lawlessness of Tombstone, the stage was set. A bounty, a dangerous outlaw, and a determined bounty hunter had all arrived at the same place at the same time. What followed would be a story of cunning, courage, and choices that could not be undone. And at the heart of it all, Silas Kane prepared for the challenge of a lifetime, knowing that patience, strategy, and respect for the woman he pursued would determine the outcome of the hunt. Silas Kane spent the next few days carefully observing Tombstone, learning its rhythms and its secrets. Every alleyway, every saloon, and every dusty street could hide a clue, and he intended to notice them all. He had learned long ago that chasing someone as clever as Liana Redhawk required more than speed or strength. It required patience, intelligence, and the ability to see patterns others overlooked. The town was bustling with people, yet Silas felt a sense of stillness whenever he thought about Liana. She was out there, somewhere, moving as freely and unpredictably as the wind across the desert. Some said she had been seen at the edge of town, near the small canyons and rocky hills, scouting and planning her next move. Others whispered that she had allies in the town itself, people who were loyal to her and willing to hide her from the law. Silas knew he had to uncover the truth without drawing attention to himself. He began spending his time in the saloons, not drinking or gambling, but listening. Conversations in Tombstone were loud and often careless, and information flowed freely when people did not realize who was listening. He learned about the latest robberies, the rumors of double crosses, and the whispers of a woman who seemed to vanish into thin air. Every word, every gesture, and every glance mattered. Silas watched the patrons closely, noting who seemed afraid, who seemed excited, and who seemed to be protecting a secret. Then, one evening in a quiet corner of a saloon, Silas caught his first real glimpse of her. She was not hiding, yet no one dared approach her. Liana Redhawk stood at a table, speaking calmly with a small group of men. Her movements were deliberate, her voice soft but commanding, and there was a confidence about her that made even the roughest men pause. Silas felt the weight of the moment. He had heard stories about her cleverness, her daring, and her ability to escape. But seeing her in person was different. She seemed untouchable, as if the world itself obeyed her commands. He studied her quietly, noting the way she moved, the way she spoke, and the way others responded to her. She had a sharp look in her eyes, one that measured everything and everyone around her. It was clear that she had learned to trust very few, and yet she carried herself with an ease that suggested she trusted herself completely. Silas realized that capturing someone like her would require not just skill but understanding. He could not treat her like any ordinary outlaw. She was clever, strategic, and dangerous, but also fascinating. Over the next few days, Silas followed her movements, always careful to remain unseen. He saw how she interacted with the townspeople, how she moved through the crowded streets, and how she disappeared when she needed to. She left no trail that an ordinary person could follow. Silas began to piece together her patterns, learning the routes she preferred, the places she avoided, and the people she trusted. Every detail mattered, and he made sure not to overlook a single one. It became clear to Silas that Liana was not reckless. Each robbery she committed, each movement she made was calculated. She did not act out of greed or cruelty. There was a purpose behind her actions, though he could not yet fully understand it. Some in the town believed she was seeking justice in her own way, striking at those who took advantage of others. Others thought she simply enjoyed the challenge of outsmarting her pursuers. Whatever her reason, it was evident that she was intelligent and careful, a woman who could not be caught through force alone. One afternoon, Silas followed a trail of rumors to the outskirts of Tombstone, near the rocky hills that bordered the desert. He had heard that Liana sometimes used the terrain to her advantage, disappearing into the landscape when necessary. The sun was hot, and the wind blew dust into his eyes, but he pressed on. Hours passed with no sign of her, yet he remained patient. He knew that the hunt required waiting, observing, and anticipating her next move. A single mistake could allow her to vanish, leaving him with nothing but frustration. As dusk approached, he finally spotted her from a distance. She was moving swiftly and carefully, almost like a shadow. Her figure blended with the rocks and dust, and Silas had to strain to keep her in sight. She paused, glanced around, and then continued on her path, disappearing into a small canyon. Silas followed, careful to stay out of sight. He admired her skill. Even from a distance, it was clear that she was always aware of her surroundings, always ready for the unexpected. Silas soon discovered that Liana was meeting someone in the canyon, a messenger perhaps, or an ally. Their conversation was brief, but it was clear that she was in charge. She gave instructions calmly, but with authority. Silas watched silently, realizing that her leadership was as natural as breathing. People listened to her, followed her, and trusted her judgment. It was another reminder that capturing her would not be simple. The more Silas learned about Liana, the more complicated his pursuit became. She was not merely an outlaw. She was clever, resourceful, and aware of every possible danger. She thought ahead, planned carefully, and always had an escape route. Silas realized that brute force or rash action would not work. He needed patience, strategy, and an understanding of who she was as a person. And he began to feel something he had not expected: respect for her abilities and curiosity about her motives. One evening back in the town, Silas overheard a group of men talking about Liana's latest robbery. They described how she had outwitted an entire shipment of silver, leaving no trace behind. Silas smiled quietly. He had seen glimpses of her skill firsthand, and the stories from others only confirmed what he already knew. She was clever, resourceful, and unpredictable. The $10,000 bounty was tempting to many, but Silas realized that capturing her would not be about the money. It would be about understanding, anticipating, and matching her intelligence. As the days passed, Silas's attention to detail grew sharper. He noticed small things about her behavior, the way she interacted with people, and the routes she preferred. He began to predict her movements, though always cautiously. Liana Redhawk was a challenge unlike any he had faced before, and every encounter, no matter how brief, reminded him of her skill and cunning. Then, one night, the moment he had been waiting for arrived. He saw her in the distance, negotiating with a group of men in one of the town's quieter streets. She spoke softly, but her tone carried authority. Silas watched as the men listened, nodded, and acted on her instructions. Even from afar, it was clear that she commanded respect and loyalty. Silas felt a mix of admiration and frustration. He knew that he was dealing with someone extraordinary, someone who could not be captured through ordinary means. He realized that this pursuit would test him in ways he had never imagined. Liana Redhawk was not just another outlaw. She was clever, strategic, and daring. She had a mind of her own, a strong will, and a remarkable ability to influence those around her. Silas knew that patience, observation, and careful planning were the only tools he had to match her. Any mistake could cost him the opportunity to capture her, or worse, put him in danger. That night, Silas sat alone, thinking about what he had learned. Liana was more than a challenge. She was a mystery. Every move she made revealed a little more about her intelligence and determination, but also left questions about her true motives. Silas understood that he needed to continue observing, waiting for the moment when he could act without tipping his hand. And he knew that when that moment came, it would test both of them, perhaps in ways neither could fully predict. As Tombstone settled under the cover of darkness, the stage was set for the next phase of the pursuit. Silas Kane had seen Liana Redhawk, studied her movements, and begun to understand her mind. He had learned that she was not reckless, that she had allies, and that she was always prepared. But he also knew that the real challenge was yet to come. The game of strategy, patience, and understanding had begun, and neither the bounty nor the law could guarantee the outcome. Silas felt a sense of anticipation mixed with caution. He respected Liana Redhawk, not just for her skill, but for her intelligence and courage. He knew that this pursuit would shape him as much as it would test him. And as he prepared for the days ahead, he understood one undeniable truth. In Tombstone, the line between law and outlaw was thin, and Liana Redhawk walked it with unmatched skill. The chase was just beginning, and Silas Kane was ready to meet it head-on, knowing that every observation, every decision, and every move mattered. The sun rose over Tombstone, casting long shadows across the dusty streets and making the town glisten with the harsh light of morning. For most people, it was another ordinary day of work, trade, and survival. For Silas Kane, it was another day in the chase, another day closer to the woman who had captivated his mind and tested his patience, Liana Redhawk. The previous days had taught him that she was more than just clever. She was cautious, calculating, and resourceful in ways that many could not match. She moved through the town like a ghost, leaving whispers and rumors in her wake. Silas had observed her interactions, her careful planning, and the respect she commanded from those around her. Every small detail mattered, and he had taken note of them all. The challenge of capturing her was unlike anything he had faced before, and it both frustrated and fascinated him. Silas knew that patience was essential. Liana did not act recklessly, and anyone who tried to force a confrontation would likely fail. He had to match her intellect, anticipate her moves, and find the moment when she would reveal just enough of herself for him to act. Over the days, he had begun to map out the network of allies she relied on, the routes she preferred, and the subtle habits that betrayed her presence. Each discovery brought him closer, yet the danger of miscalculating grew with every step. Late one afternoon, Silas followed a trail that led him to the outskirts of town, near the hills that stretched into the desert. Rumors had placed Liana there, moving cautiously among the rocks and canyons. The desert was harsh, hot, and unforgiving, yet it gave her an advantage. Her knowledge of the terrain allowed her to disappear easily, leaving anyone pursuing her confused and frustrated. Silas knew that if he wanted to catch her, he needed to move carefully, avoid mistakes, and use the environment to his advantage as well. Hours passed as he tracked her from a distance, watching her every move. She stopped occasionally to observe the landscape, scanning for threats or obstacles. Her attention to detail was extraordinary, and Silas realized that he was learning something important. Liana was not just intelligent, she was adaptable. She could respond to changing circumstances quickly and effectively. Any confrontation would have to account for her skill, her awareness, and her quick thinking. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, Silas finally saw her up close. She was moving through a narrow canyon, alert and cautious. Her eyes darted constantly, scanning the rocks and shadows. Silas noted the way she carried herself, confident, composed, and ready for action. Even in this remote part of the desert, she commanded attention. Every small movement was purposeful, and it was clear that she anticipated potential threats before they appeared. He followed silently, keeping to the shadows, careful not to reveal his presence. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the first real opportunity to observe her without interference. Liana paused near a cluster of rocks and glanced around, then crouched to speak to a man who had approached from a nearby ridge. Their conversation was brief, but Silas noticed the authority in her voice. The man listened intently, following her instructions without question. She was clearly a leader, someone others respected and trusted. Silas felt a mixture of admiration and caution. Capturing her would require more than strength. It would require strategy and intelligence. As darkness approached, the desert began to change. Shadows lengthened and the sounds of the town grew distant. Silas knew that nightfall could offer him an advantage, or a disaster. He could approach her under cover of darkness, but one misstep could reveal him and allow her to vanish once again. He moved carefully, keeping low and silent, watching her every move. The tension in the air was almost tangible, as if the desert itself held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Suddenly, Liana paused and looked directly in his direction, or at least she seemed to sense that she was being watched. Silas froze, realizing that she might have noticed him. He had heard stories of her intuition, her ability to detect danger, and now he understood it firsthand. She moved slightly, changing her position, scanning the rocks, and then continued forward, seemingly unbothered. Silas breathed a quiet sigh of relief. This was a game of patience, observation, and respect for her abilities. Any hasty action could ruin everything. The next few days were filled with a tense rhythm. Silas would track her from a distance, carefully noting her movements, her interactions, and the places she frequented. Liana, as clever as she was, continued to leave subtle clues about her intentions, paths in the desert, markings on rocks, and interactions with allies. Silas studied them all, building a mental map of her strategies and habits. Each observation brought him closer to understanding her, but also reminded him of the difficulty of the task. She was always thinking several steps ahead, always preparing for the unexpected. Then came the first real confrontation, though it was not what either of them had expected. Liana had been meeting with a small group near a rocky outcrop, discussing plans and strategies. Silas had observed her approach, careful to remain hidden. But as he moved to get closer, a sudden noise startled him, causing a small rock slide. Liana's head snapped toward the sound, and for a brief moment their eyes met. It was not a battle, not a fight, but a moment of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that the hunter and the hunted had met. Liana did not flee. she did not show fear. Instead, she studied him, her eyes sharp and calculating. Silas realized that this encounter had changed something. The chase was no longer just about capturing her. It had become personal, a test of intellect, patience, and understanding. Both of them recognized the challenge in each other, the skill, and the resolve that set them apart from ordinary people. In that instant, Silas knew that catching her would require more than the usual tactics. It would require respect, careful planning, and perhaps even an understanding of her motives. Over the next several days, the tension between them grew. Silas continued to track her, but he also began to study her interactions with others, learning more about her character, her decisions, and the way she inspired loyalty. Liana, for her part, seemed aware that someone was following her, though she did not reveal it. Their movements became a silent game, each aware of the other, each testing the limits of patience and skill. Every encounter, every observation, reinforced the complexity of the pursuit. Silas began to see that Liana's actions were not merely about evading capture. They were about survival strategy and principle. She was clever, yes, but she was also careful, ethical in her own way, and aware of the consequences of her actions. Silas respected that. It was a rare quality in someone so skilled at eluding the law. The more he observed her, the more he realized that capturing her would not be an act of dominance, but a challenge of understanding, respect, and strategy. One evening, as the desert sky turned shades of orange and purple, Silas found himself reflecting on the pursuit. He had tracked her movements, studied her habits, and observed her interactions with others. He had seen her skill, her intelligence, and her resourcefulness. But he also realized something important. The chase had changed him. It had sharpened his mind, tested his patience, and reminded him of the complexity of human nature. Liana Redhawk was more than a target. She was a challenge, a puzzle, and a mirror of the very qualities that had shaped his own life. The following day, Silas witnessed another remarkable display of her cunning. Liana had set up a small diversion to mislead anyone following her. She moved silently, leaving behind subtle signs that pointed in one direction while she took another. Silas observed from a distance, understanding her intentions. He could have rushed to intercept her, but he chose patience. She was teaching him something without knowing it, to respect her skill, to anticipate her moves, and to think beyond the obvious. By the end of Part 3, the tension between Silas and Liana had grown to a silent understanding. They were both aware of the other, testing and learning with each interaction. The pursuit had become more than a simple chase. It was a battle of wits, strategy, and patience. Silas knew that the next phase would be critical. Any misstep could mean losing her forever, or risking everything he had learned. The desert, the town, and the bounty had created a stage for an extraordinary encounter, one that was just beginning to unfold. Silas Kane understood that capturing Liana Redhawk would not be a simple matter of luck or force. It would require intelligence, patience, and respect for the woman who had become both his target and his greatest challenge. The hunt had intensified, and neither of them would be the same after what was to come. The days in Tombstone had begun to feel longer, heavier, and more tense than ever. Silas Kane moved through the town with quiet focus, aware that every step, every glance, and every choice could shift the balance between success and failure. The pursuit of Liana Redhawk had become more than just a bounty hunt. It was a test of patience, skill, and moral judgment. He had observed her cleverness, her courage, and her careful planning. But now he faced a new challenge, the threat of others who would not hesitate to harm her for their own gain. Rumors spread quickly through the town that a rival gang had arrived, drawn by the promise of the $10,000 bounty.
They were ruthless men who cared little for law, honor, or strategy. They only sought the reward.
Silas had learned to respect threats that moved with intelligence, but these men were different. They were unpredictable, violent, and willing to take risks that could cost lives. Liana, as usual, seemed aware of the danger long before anyone else. She moved cautiously, leaving subtle signals that hinted at the presence of threats without revealing her exact position. Silas understood immediately. The stakes had risen, and the pursuit was no longer about catching her. It was about protecting her from a danger she could not control alone. For Silas, this created a moral dilemma. He had been hired to capture her, to collect the bounty, and yet his growing respect for Liana made him question what justice really meant. She was clever, yes, but she was also cautious, calculated, and aware of the consequences of her actions. She did not harm innocents, she did not act recklessly. And now, faced with the threat of the rival gang, Silas realized that following the law blindly might put her in grave danger. The choice before him was simple in theory, but impossible in practice. Pursue her for the bounty, or intervene to save her, risking his reputation, his career, and perhaps even his life. He watched her carefully as she moved through the outskirts of Tombstone, a shadow among the rocks and desert brush. Her allies were few but loyal, and they communicated in subtle gestures and whispered words. Silas noted every detail, realizing that Liana's life was more complicated than he had first imagined. She was not merely fleeing, she was strategizing, planning and preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the gang. Her ability to think ahead, anticipate danger, and act decisively impressed him, but it also weighed on him. The danger she faced was real, and he could not ignore it. The following day, the tension reached a boiling point. Silas learned from a local informant that the rival gang had located one of Liana's safe points near a rocky ridge outside town. They intended to ambush her and claim the bounty, and time was critical. Silas knew that if he arrived too late, she could be seriously harmed, or worse.
He made his choice.
Leaving behind caution, he moved swiftly but carefully, tracking her movements while preparing to confront the gang. Every step required precision. One mistake could mean disaster. When he reached the ridge, the scene was chaotic. The rival gang had already arrived, and their shadows stretched across the rocks like dark specters. Liana, for her part, was calm and composed, assessing the situation with sharp focus. She did not panic. She adapted. Silas watched as she signaled to her allies, guiding them through subtle maneuvers that minimized their exposure while keeping the gang off balance. Even under extreme pressure, she maintained control, a combination of skill, intelligence, and courage that Silas could not help but admire. A brief exchange of gunfire erupted, more as a warning than an attempt to harm. Silas took cover, calculating his moves while observing her strategy. Liana moved with confidence and precision, using the landscape to her advantage. The gang was aggressive but disorganized, making mistakes that Liana exploited silently. Silas realized that she had anticipated this confrontation long before it occurred. Her ability to remain calm, even in life-threatening situations, distinguished her from ordinary outlaws. Every action she took was deliberate, every decision calculated. In that moment, Silas made a choice that would define the remainder of their relationship. Instead of pursuing her for the bounty, he focused on helping her avoid the gang. He used his knowledge of the terrain, his understanding of the men's tactics, and his own skill to intervene, creating distractions and drawing attention away from her. It was a calculated risk. By doing so, he placed himself directly in danger, but he could not allow an innocent life, or one guided by intelligence and courage, to be destroyed by reckless men seeking wealth. After several tense minutes, the gang was forced to retreat, confused and frustrated by the unexpected resistance. Silas remained hidden until the sounds of retreating boots faded into the distance. When he finally emerged, he saw Liana observing him from behind a cluster of rocks. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of caution, curiosity, and respect. Silas approached slowly, raising his hand slightly to show that he meant no harm. She studied him for a long moment before nodding, a silent acknowledgement of what had just occurred. For Silas, the encounter marked a turning point. The pursuit was no longer a simple matter of law or reward. It had become a partnership of sorts, defined by mutual respect and unspoken understanding. He saw in her not just a target, but a person who operated with intelligence, skill, and principle. Liana Redhawk was not reckless, cruel, or careless. She was deliberate, resourceful, and honorable in her own way. And he realized that helping her had changed him, forcing him to reevaluate what justice and duty really meant. The following days were tense but strategic. Silas and Liana moved through Tombstone and the surrounding desert with caution, aware that the threat of the rival gang remained. They communicated indirectly through observation, gestures, and silent signals. There was no need for words. Each recognized the skill and intelligence of the other. Silas continued to respect her abilities while also preparing for the next challenge. Liana, for her part, seemed aware of his presence but remained focused on her own plans. Their dynamic had shifted. He was no longer a mere pursuer, and she was no longer a solitary outlaw. Despite the danger, Silas also began to notice moments of humanity. Liana showed care for her allies, a quiet consideration for those she trusted, and an unwavering focus on survival without unnecessary harm. Her courage and intelligence inspired those around her, and it became clear why people were willing to follow her, even in the face of danger. Silas, observing from a distance, began to admire her not only as a target but as a person. She was clever, strategic, and daring, yet she was guided by principles that few outlaws possessed. The moral tension weighed heavily on Silas. He had chosen to protect her in the moment of danger, but the bounty, the law, and his own reputation still lingered in the background. He understood that one day he would have to make a decision that could define his life and hers. The choice between duty and conscience, between reward and principle, loomed like a shadow over every action. Yet in that uncertainty he felt a sense of purpose and resolve he had not experienced in years. One evening, as the sun set over the desert, Silas watched Liana from a distance. She moved with quiet confidence, her figure outlined against the glowing horizon. He reflected on the events of the past days, the pursuit, the confrontation, the narrow escapes, and the silent understanding that had formed between them. The chase had taught him patience, observation, and respect. It had reminded him that justice was not always about money, law, or punishment. Sometimes it was about recognizing skill, courage, and principle. Silas realized that the true challenge of the pursuit was not simply capturing Liana Redhawk. It was understanding her, respecting her, and navigating the complex moral landscape that surrounded them both. The rival gang, the bounty, and the law were obstacles, but the deeper challenge lay in choosing what kind of person he wanted to be in a world that often rewarded greed and recklessness. Liana had become more than a target. She had become a measure of his own courage, patience, and sense of justice. By the end of this part of the story, Silas Kane had made a decision that would shape the remainder of the pursuit. He would not abandon his principles, nor would he blindly follow the law or the lure of the bounty. He would continue to observe, learn, and act with intelligence and care, knowing that every choice mattered. Liana Redhawk remained a challenge, a mystery, and a force of intellect and courage. The hunt had intensified, the stakes had risen, and the path ahead was fraught with danger. But Silas was ready to face it, guided by respect, skill, and the difficult choices that defined his life. The desert in Tombstone had become a stage for courage, intelligence, and morality. Silas Kane and Liana Redhawk moved through it like two forces testing each other, learning from each other and shaping their own destinies in a land where danger and opportunity were never far apart. The story was far from over, and the decisions made in these critical days would echo into the future, defining the lives of both hunter and hunted. The desert sun was sinking low, painting Tombstone in shades of gold and deep orange. Shadows stretched across the streets, the saloons, and the dusty alleys, and the town seemed to hold its breath. For weeks, Silas Kane had been tracking Liana Redhawk, learning her moves, respecting her skills, and weighing the weight of the bounty against his own moral compass. Now the moment of decision had arrived. The pursuit had built to a point where choices mattered, not just for him, but for Liana and everyone caught in the path of danger. Silas had learned a lot about her cleverness, her courage, her ability to anticipate threats. But he had also discovered something unexpected. Liana was not merely an outlaw to be captured. She was a person guided by principles, a person who took risks to protect others, and a person whose intelligence demanded respect. He had followed her through desert canyons, town streets, and secret hideouts. He had seen her outwit rival gangs, evade lawmen, and survive situations that would have destroyed ordinary people. The more he learned, the harder it became to think of her as simply a target. The final confrontation began when Silas received word that Liana had been cornered by lawmen near the outskirts of town. They had tracked her movements carefully, unaware of the rival gang's interference or of Silas's presence. She was surrounded, her usual escape routes cut off, and yet she stood calm, evaluating her options. Silas moved swiftly, knowing that arriving too late could mean disaster. Every step through the dusty desert carried weight. He had prepared for this moment, not with a gun drawn, but with patience, strategy, and careful observation. As he approached, he saw Liana standing among the lawmen, her figure tall and unyielding. The officers were confident, believing that the bounty would soon be claimed. Liana, however, was not panicking. Her eyes scanned the surroundings, looking for opportunities, weaknesses, and allies. She had survived too many dangerous situations to show fear now. Silas observed from a distance, noting the tension in the air, the tight grip on rifles, and the careful positioning of each lawman. He understood that this was not only a test of skill but a test of judgment, for him, for her, and for those seeking the bounty. For Silas, the decision was clear, yet difficult. He could step forward and capture her, claiming the $10,000 reward and the approval of the law. But he also knew that doing so would violate the respect and understanding he had developed over weeks of careful pursuit. Liana was skilled, resourceful, and principled in her own way. She had not harmed anyone unnecessarily, and she had survived because of her intelligence and courage, not because of luck alone. Silas understood that he could not take the easy path without betraying his own moral code. He stepped forward, moving carefully between the shadows and the approaching lawmen. Liana noticed him immediately, her eyes narrowing, but there was no fear, only recognition. In that moment, they both understood that the game had changed. The hunter was no longer pursuing her simply for reward or duty. He had become a protector, a partner in survival, and someone who recognized her skill and intelligence. The tension in the air was thick, but it was tempered by mutual respect and unspoken understanding. The lawmen, unaware of Silas's intentions, moved closer, expecting to apprehend Liana without resistance. Silas had to act quickly. Using careful timing and subtle distractions, he created openings, drawing attention away from her and buying her precious moments. Liana seized the opportunity, moving with the precision and awareness that had made her legendary. Together, they navigated the dusty terrain, avoiding unnecessary confrontation and slowly slipping out of the lawman's grasp. It was a delicate dance, one that required trust, timing, and careful calculation. By the time the sun had dipped below the horizon, Liana and Silas had reached a small, secluded canyon outside of town. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of desert sage and the faint hum of nocturnal life. Liana paused to catch her breath, her sharp eyes scanning the surrounding darkness for any lingering threats. Silas approached carefully, keeping his distance but watching her every move. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a bond formed through observation, mutual respect, and shared risk. In that quiet moment, Silas faced the ultimate choice. He could turn her in, claim the bounty, and return to a life of reputation and reward. Or he could let her go, honoring the intelligence, courage, and principle that had made her so extraordinary. He knew that choosing the latter would mean giving up wealth, recognition, and perhaps even trust from those who had sent him to capture her. But it would also mean doing what he believed was right. His decision reflected more than just strategy. It reflected the man he had become over the course of the pursuit. Silas took a deep breath and stepped aside, allowing Liana the chance to escape into the desert night. Her eyes met his, sharp and questioning, but there was a flicker of understanding. She did not speak, and neither did he. Words were unnecessary. Their actions had said more than any conversation could. In that moment, the story of hunter and hunted transformed into a story of respect, intelligence, and courage. Silas had made his choice, and Liana had earned the freedom that her skill and bravery deserved. As she disappeared into the darkness, Silas felt a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. He had not claimed the bounty, nor had he captured the legendary outlaw. Yet he had achieved something far more meaningful. He had honored the principles of intelligence, patience, and courage that had guided him throughout the pursuit. The experience had changed him, reminding him that the measure of a person was not in wealth or recognition, but in choices, integrity, and the willingness to do what is right, even when it is difficult. The following days in Tombstone were quieter, though the story of Liana Redhawk and Silas Kane spread quickly. People whispered about the bounty, the clever outlaw who had escaped, and the bounty hunter who had chosen principle over reward. The tale became legend, told in saloons and around campfires, a story of courage, intelligence, and the difficult choices that defined life in the Wild West. Silas remained in Tombstone for a time, reflecting on the pursuit, the risks, and the moral challenges he had faced. He understood that the story of Liana Redhawk was more than a chase. It was a lesson in respect, strategy, and the power of choice. Though he never saw Liana again, her presence lingered in his thoughts. The hunt had tested his patience, his judgment, and his understanding of justice. He realized that the greatest victories were not always the ones marked by wealth or recognition, but those achieved through wisdom, courage, and respect for others. Liana Redhawk had outwitted him, inspired him, and reminded him of the value of principle over profit. The legend of their pursuit endured, a story of the Wild West that celebrated not just skill and daring, but also morality, intelligence, and honor. In the end, Silas Kane left Tombstone a changed man. The town continued its noisy, chaotic life, but he carried with him the lessons learned from the chase. Liana Redhawk remained a symbol of courage, cleverness, and defiance, an outlaw who could not be tamed by law or bounty, and a woman whose skill demanded respect. Silas understood that some stories do not end with capture or reward. They end with understanding, choice, and the recognition of something greater than oneself. And so the tale of Tombstone, the $10,000 bounty, Liana Redhawk, and the bounty hunter who could not walk away became legend. It was a story of intelligence, courage, and principle set against the harsh beauty of the desert, a reminder that even in a world full of danger, lawlessness, and greed, respect, patience, and moral strength could define the true measure of a person. Silas Kane had faced the greatest challenge of his life, not through gunfire or confrontation, but through understanding and choice. And in doing so, he proved that the Wild West could be a place not just of danger, but of honor, strategy, and respect.